I know Rachel is teaching casting today, so she can't be here with us. But I'm so glad for those of you who could come make it out for the second half. I'm going to start with a just kind of really brief synopsis of what we covered the first session to go into where we left off. And then at the end, I'll jump back into my PowerPoint because I have a few short videos about the investment and casting process that I can't do here in my kitchen. I would love to bring this into my house. I think I would immediately being end up having to file for divorce. The amount of investment I would, ugh, it would just be terrible. Um, so for the first session, we briefly kind of went over how I start my designing process, um, looking at the sketches that I make. So I'm going to switch on over to my other camera here that has been working all right. Hopefully it will continue to work. So I had, okay, wait, there we go. With the ring that I was starting off with, I was taking it from an image from a TV show. So it was pretty blurry, didn't have a lot of details. So the first thing I had wanted to do was draw it out to scale so I could use this. Let me see, I think I can flip this. So it actually, there we go. Uh, Draw it out to scale so I could use this as a way to actually transfer my dimensions onto my wax with my trusty little compass here. And starting off with just the really base dimensions of how wide, how tall, so that I can take advantage of these blocks of hard wax, these flat top ring wax tubes that they carry that are made by Ferris. Um, I really like to have as much room as possible for this upper part of the wax. So when I was building into my design, I was kind of thinking about how much material I would have to take advantage of in this chunky part of his face here. Um, and once I had this block of wax cut out and transferred, and I just want to reiterate the best way for you to get a nice even cut is to kind of slowly cut around the outside instead of coming down like it's a loaf of bread, but to slowly cut all around the outside, moving in a circle. If you do the loaf of bread, you get this really terrible, uh, oof, that was a bad cut, trying to just go straight down, and I lost control of the saw blade in the thickest part. So coming all around from the outside and cutting little cuts until you get all the way through is going to give you a much nicer finish. Um, and then I transfer those details into the side of the wax using the same calipers and a little sharp tipped scribe also that I have. Uh, until I have kind of this blocky configuration that I'll then start approaching in a very two-dimensional form. Starting with areas that I know I need to remove that are easy to approach, like the triangle in between his ears, and just going straight back, uh, as well as the little triangles straight down by his nose and going straight back. And then every time I take away a side of a material where I might be removing my scribed details, I just want to go and evaluate if any of that detailing needs to be carved in before I remove that material. So they start off looking a lot like little Minecraft characters, very blocky, very two-dimensional. And what I'm using to carve them primarily are metal burrs, just the typical ones that we have for working in metal. These aren't burrs that are sold to be wax carving burrs. These are just the traditional uh, standard jewelry burrs, but I do keep them only for wax carving needs. Once I have a set that is for wax, it stays for wax because the metal is going to really dull these out very quickly, and then they're not going to cut as satisfyingly. And the shape that I like for removing a lot of material really quickly are these flame burrs. It has a nice rounded area that I can kind of angle towards to remove large chunks of materials. And then it comes to usually a nice little point that I can angle to get into finer places like that. And this is the size that I like to work with for removing a lot of material. It's kind of a medium sized almost. It's not so small that I'm just going to sit in one little channel and work away at something, but it's also not so big that I'm worried that I'm going to remove material that I find important and actually maybe gouge too much of my material back out. This is a little Hardell handheld rechargeable Dremel, and I have found it to be absolutely fantastic. I'll email over the link for it. I'm not paid by them, but this was like $25 and I'm very charmed by it. And it has a little light on the front so that it points at your piece so that it's lit up as well. And when I do start getting into some of the smaller, finer details of the refinement of the piece as well, I do usually switch to an optimizer now because my eyes just aren't what they used to be. And not having to strain with this dark, dark wax, this is the dark purple that I prefer. Um, it really does get sometimes hard to see down into these areas in the recesses where the shadows are falling and see what you're actually doing. So I do have a light on my optimizer as well, so I can just not only see a little bit closer, but also see a little bit more of the details of what I'm working for the piece. So when I'm going in with my burr, I look a lot at how woodworkers carve their pieces, and I found it very effective to do this kind of two-dimensional channeling process of going from one direction and then another to remove materials and start refining it down. And then once I've gotten into kind of this blocky shape, I can go in and start softening the curves in between where those two areas meet and the object starts rounding out. So always the most important thing that I look at when I'm starting out is what are my highest points? What do I need to preserve the most material for? And then where are we going back from there? So for that little guy, once I've gotten him down into more of the material being removed, I have this side here that I've started to come in with the wax wolf micro carvers, but you can also come in as well with diamond. I think it's trying to focus on the background and the object at the same time. You can also come in with diamond burrs and use it as a way to sand the surface down, which I really like, especially for areas in the recesses, like behind the ear, where I might want to know that my surface is flatter before I start going in and refining it. But just like with the other burrs, any of my materials, once I have a set that's for wax, I label it for wax and I just keep it for that material. Because if I go in with metal or some other material, it's going to impregnate into the pieces and then it's going to transfer back to my wax. It's going to kind of impregnate that wax with scratches and then continue to transfer to my piece. My brain is still always, whenever I have a camera, is which direction do I move to get you back into center? So we have this side is still at the Minecraft blockiness that it was from the time before. I had gone in with the burr and knew that this was my high point and started just carving away material to get back to the space that I knew was going to be this spot. The wax micro carvers, I had sent an email around. I had thought that you could still purchase those individually, but it's only the larger size that some companies will let you purchase one piece at a time. The wax micro carvers just come in the kit of 8. But there is right now, Rio is having a 20% off with code Wolf20 on their wolf wax carving thing. So there is a sale going on right now where you can save some money on those pieces. Um, I tend to work in very, very, very small scale, very, very small detail. So the micro carvers work very well for what I'm doing, but they are smaller sizes of the standard carvers. So the ones that I'm using primarily, you'll be able to see a little bit better on this scale. This is the standard size of the small hollower that I'm using. And I love this piece as a way to come in and actually kind of cross hatch across the surface to use it as a way to start leveling off uh, the piece itself. Is my little thing? Okay, it's still on. So I'll go from one direction to another and just make little tiny gentle stripes and start smoothing and leveling out the surface that I'm working with from what my uh, cutting burrs have left behind. The diamond burrs also work really, really well for those. And these I've had as a set from, I feel like Harbor Freight or something equally inexpensive. And I've had them for probably about 15 years. And because I'm only using them on wax, they just work fantastically. But I love these little cylinder shapes for going in and evening out flat surfaces like behind the ears, and the little flame shapes and ball shapes for going in and smoothing out round surfaces that I want to kind of even out. And just like with the cutting burrs, you don't want to put too much pressure on these pieces when you're using them. I see a lot of people are kind of like pressing and grinding when they get these set up. But you actually want to leave enough room for that tool to have the space to do what it needs to do. So when we press too hard on the tool itself, it doesn't leave enough of a spot for that piece to do what it needs to do. Oh, these little bad boys are a thicker collet than what I need. Okay. I know. Whenever I look at a flex shaft to get as well, or any one of these little tiny handheld Dremel pieces, I always want to double check and make sure they come with the extra collets so that I can switch out what size it's going to be if I need to. It can handle larger pieces or smaller pieces. Because if it's just going to fit the one size, like a 3/32 inch shank, I have too many pieces usually that need to be bigger than that. Bitch, oh no. Do you not go in? Oh, I see. I don't need a call at all. Yeah, I think these ones don't fit the collet that I have for this piece, which I should have tested this one. They fit the old one.
Hosanna, we've got a question from the chat from Valerie. Are there any issues with the wax clogging the diamond burrs?
So far, I haven't had a terrible amount of problems. Sometimes it does build up, and I'll usually go through and run it um, on my fingers or a little piece of fabric and kind of get the wax that's built up off of those pieces. And I feel like you could probably, most of the wax is a pretty low temperature melting. You could probably gently heat them to get it off there as well. But so far, anytime I have a buildup like this one, I think this one you can see has gotten some like wax impregnated down in there. Uh, if you have the soft end of a file brush as well, this will come out really well. But usually I just will wipe them against something like a piece of fabric and that wax ends up coming out. I do think maybe if you were trying to use them on a very soft wax, you could have issues with the material kind of building up and not being able to get out of there.
So you're
But
mainly using those, the diamond burrs, as just a much less aggressive carving burr?
yes, more of a step in between like a leveling or sanding. So I'll use the burrs to go in and remove as much material as possible. And then the diamond burrs work very well, either in place of the not fully in place of the wolf carving tools, but they can come in and do a lot of really gentle leveling on a piece. I think all of these are.
That makes
Oh,
sense.
um, I found one that's smaller. Yay. Okay, so this is just a little ball diamond burr. And this little guy has a positive and negative speed power, which I love for this piece to be able to slow it down. All right, I'm gonna turn this guy on. Again, my little so I can go in with that and remove a lot of the unevenness that the burrs leave behind. They leave kind of this um like pebbly surface where it's gone deeper in some areas, it's higher in other areas. So the burrs themselves and the wolf tools, what I'm usually doing is going in between and kind of evening that surface out. So I still at this part of the process with the wolf tools and with the diamond bits, approach it and kind of thinking about it almost like the lines on a globe, kind of tracking those curves and evening out those curves from one direction to another in really small, little tiny strokes. Um, there are, I'm sure, less OCD, faster ways to get at the surface. But for me, it almost becomes like a little bit of a meditation process where I'm just kind of gently brushing away anything that isn't my object uh, as I refine the surface. So I'll come across a curve like this, looking at the direction of that curve, kind of like how my eye is crossing over the piece, and then come again from another area, following the low parts and the high parts of the carving in just little tiny baby strokes. The wolf tools leave a pretty shiny surface to the piece itself. There have been a few times where I've felt like the surface that it's leaving behind is so polished that I almost don't need to come in with a final polish. But then I still do because I love high polishing my waxes so that I can have as minimal a cleanup process after casting as possible. And the little brush to get all those little tiny wax shavings really does help to just keep on hand to have that to refer to. So when I am happy with the shape that I've carved into this piece, I polish my waxes with Goo Gone. So Goo Gone, you can buy it in smaller things, but I love Goo Gone for polishing waxes. And what it is doing is lightly melting the surface of the wax. So I will sometimes save this part of the process before I go in and I put in those final touches to my piece so that I don't worry that if I have something terribly delicate, I might melt it away. And for my Goo Gone, I'm just starting with a Q-tip that I'm then cutting in half and putting just a little touch of Goo Gone into the tip of it. So I'll usually put it right up to the Q-tip and just give it a nice little squirt. And they are essentially just a little bit bigger than the 3/32 inch shanks. But once I have it into my piece, I use it while it's spinning and we go across the surface and it is going to just gently kind of melt that surface of the wax into a nice high polish. It is going to spray just a little bit of Goo Gone in most places. Let me let it spray excessively away from the camera before we come back. Okay, so I'll usually, when it first starts out, it kind of coats the piece and it'll look really, really wet. You'll have a hard time seeing the details. And I'll usually keep going until it kind of, you can see the wax again. Uh, if you have excess Goo Gone, you can just rinse it off with water and get it off your wax model. Absolutely fine. And then once I have that nice shiny surface, I can come in with my smaller, tiny detailer and cut those details that are in the wings so that it just gives that extra texture to the piece. So I've done all the kind of sideways curving that I want for the shape, but just to ensure that I don't destroy those little tiny details, I'll come in afterwards and put those in. And usually, how I like to start a cut line is by backing myself up already into the low point and then going out towards the edge. Watch me absolutely destroy it. But the nice thing with something kind of organic like a feather is that, oh, see, it just went off sideways. I can just be like, that's just one of its other things. Let's start deepening that detail into there. And then if I feel like the details that I'm carving are too sharp, I can go back in with the Goo Gone as well, and just kind of clean those up. Sometimes I will save Goo Gone until after I have attached my sprues, just because it creates such a slippery surface to this wax that I'll have a hard time attaching my sprues. And then I can kind of hold on to my sprues like a lollipop while I polish my wax. So sometimes I will switch the process of this so that I have something to hold on to and to make my spruing process a little bit easier. For the inside of the ring as well, I mentioned when I am carving down this, I will stop just a little bit before the size I'm going for because I also do want to finish the inside of my waxes as well. And there's going to be a little bit of material removed as well when I cut my sprues off and then file that surface back. I used to go straight up to the size I needed, and then I would always find that my rings were just a little bit bigger than I intended them because I was not accounting for that cleanup process. And just like with a regular metal ring, I go in with a splint shank mandrel and a 320 or 400 grit sandpaper. and sand the inside of my wax as well, and then high polish that as well. Um, so that every part of the ring, when it comes out of the casting, is going to be as quick and easy of a cleanup process as possible. With these pieces, all I ended up having to do was cut off the sprues and clean up that area, and then take them to a buffing wheel to bring that back out, and then a liver of sulfur. So I don't really do post cleanup on my pieces, which is absolutely lovely. So with two-part wax welding as well and getting your sprues, we have an issue in California now with denatured alcohol. They decided we can't sell that anymore because I have always been a firm believer in these lovely little alcohol bombs, the holy hand grenades. I love them. I've given myself several impromptu haircuts by forgetting where they are and dipping my head over when I'm looking at something, but I am truly, truly addicted to these little guys. You can get 99% isopropyl alcohol will also work now. For those of us who are like me in a place where you can no longer get denatured alcohol, I am working on the same jug of denatured alcohol that I've had for like the last 5 years since I moved here, and I'm terrified of it losing and me having to source just a lot of 99% isopropyl alcohol after that, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I don't typically fill up my little alcohol bombs much farther than the halfway point unless I know that I'm planning on just sitting there and working for hours and hours and hours. Because eventually the alcohol will dissipate from these bad boys and you're just left behind with water. Whenever you fill them up, what you want to start off with doing if you are an alcohol bomb user is something called priming the wick, because this little wick is going all the way down through in here and collecting that alcohol back up to the top. So whenever I've first filled my container, I always tip it over a few times so that we take that alcohol up to the wick and then are able to get it to that top part of it. And I'm going to try to be really mindful of not sticking it directly under my camera and immediately melting my new little webtop desktop camera thing. So with two-part wax welding, which is how I made this little dude, I wanted him to have a very thin band. So I didn't want to essentially take away so much of this material for him to be just kind of a small thing. So his little face was carved just off of a nice little chunk of wax. And then this other little piece was actually just a repurposing of one of the strange slivers that comes off when you are cutting away like at an amount of material. I believe it was one of these guys, but just slightly different shaped. But I like to use the sprue wax as well. Works really, really well for a thick gauge wire if you're ever doing a two-part wax mold. So for those of you who don't like to use the alcohol bomb, the uh, electric 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 wax pens work really, really well. But what I don't necessarily love about them for me is that then I can't use all the lovely dental tools that I've collected. So that's why I'm sticking with the alcohol for now. Let's get this lit. The little, let me just tilt it really quick over so you can see it, but the little fire is pretty subtle. Ooh, it comes up better on camera. But it's pretty subtle when you're in person and you're staring directly at it. So just do be very mindful when you are whipping your head around like I like to do of where that fire is, because I have definitely given myself new bangs. So this is an 8 gauge sprue wax wire. I love using my sprue wires as something they are not intended for. Use all parts of the animal to make whatever you need. But this I just bent around the same little tape dowel that I'll use when I'm working on waxes. And this is just painter's tape that I wrapped around a dowel until it got to a specific size that I like working with. So I think this is a size 9 round of tape. And then just bent that wax wire around the outside very gently until I had a nice little circle that I could work with, just like making jump rings. And when I use my wax tools, you don't want them to get particularly too hot. We would put them into the fire until you would see just a little touch of smoke pull off of them when you pulled it away. This one, I think I left dirty. So it's some of that puff of smoke is just, ooh, yeah, you're dirty. Some of that puff of smoke is just some of the old wax coming off of there. Um, but when I'm working with this wax wire, I like to overlap it. So just like when you're cutting a jump ring, I can come down. Oh, I talked too long while my tool cooled down. I can come down and just cut pretty nice and evenly through those two. Boop. And have a ring that has a pretty nice connection point there. So with a lot of the softer waxes, like the pinks and the reds, they have pretty low melting temperatures. The harder waxes, the purples, the dark green, stuff like that, these have pretty high melting temperatures. So a lot of times when I'm wax welding a piece together, I want to make sure that I actually see that purple wax melt a little bit when I'm joining them together and not just that it's some sort of surface connection. Because then what can happen is that when we go to invest them, they pop apart. I just want to weld my little jump ring seam shut here and always let that wax cool down just a little bit before you, let me get a little closer, before we transition over to a new side so that I'm not over melting my little guy. And as you heat these guys, wax will start running up to this part of the tool. So sometimes as you heat this tip and you tilt it, extra wax will kind of run down to the tip point of that. So I just try to be aware of it. It's something I can use, for my advantage if I need to, but that seam is not as good as I wanted it to be. I'll have like a little scrap piece of wax that I can steal from. And then I'll heat here so that the wax drips down to the tip and then pull it through and let that wax drop onto a spot that I need to when I need to fill that area. All right, and then I want to let that go before I get that dried because I want to hide that same seam. May as well use it for the wax weld spot as well. But I want to make sure that it's nice and stabilized before I start trying to heat it up again so that I don't melt my ring into a million pieces. Um, I also realized that I lost my sticky wax, which sticky wax is usually yellow or clear. I think I probably gave it to someone, but I have a little bit of extra sticky red wax left over. And that really does help when you're connecting these softer waxes to a hard wax, because they just don't necessarily want to stick as easily as they could. So having a little bit of a sticky positioning wax is going to be helpful in terms of getting that on. And I might want to just give myself a little mark for where I'm aiming for with the sticky wax. Do, 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 do. Okay. That looks pretty good in terms of where I wanted it. But now I have to make sure that this connection is really, really good, especially for when it's going to be coming into the investment process. The investment process vibrates it. So it is going to essentially jiggle apart any. No, actually, this is not the most perfect angle for this piece. If I pick it up, I might lose it. Put it like that so I have my little thumb keeping it in spot. I'm gonna attempt to not burn myself. And I can feel the soft wax melting, but I wasn't seeing the tool go into the purple wax. So I just went back in there until I was actually sure that that purple wax has melted. And then I want to make sure that I let that dry and set up for a second before I move on to anywhere else. And just like with screwing or attaching to a button, you don't want to go all the way around in a circle because the wax is just going to kind of slowly tip over. So just like with setting a bezel or doing anything else, riveting, we kind of want to work in that side of a cross and go to the next opposite direction before approaching the two sides. And I want to make sure that it's hot enough that I can feel that hard wax actually melting. And then let that cool and set up before I would come around to approach it from this angle and then this angle. So outside of it popping free when you're investing, the other thing that could happen is that investment, if it stays together, investment could get in between these two little join areas and firm up so that you have some sort of weird little jagged, sharp angle. And what will usually happen is that when you go to pour your metal into that spot, that sharp little jagged spot of investment breaks free and it creates a spot where you have a pit or a hole somewhere else in your model because a little chunk of investment has come and floated. So we want to make sure that we get those seams nice and buttery smooth, just like you were soldering, so that that pesky little investment can't get in there and ruin all your hard work. Oh, I tilted the tool the wrong angle. I normally like to come in this way, and it took a little chunk out of my wax wire there. So that's something that I would evaluate before casting this piece. So when we go to sprue, your wax model is done. You're excited, you're ready. Now we have to prep these pieces for the parts that are going to carry our metal through our pieces. So there's a few things that we have to keep in mind when we think about the positioning of where we connect our sprues. We want to think about where the largest chunk of the metal is going to be. So like with this guy, I didn't hollow out the back of their heads. So there is just so much material at the front of these pieces. This is a chunky boy right here. Back here on the detailing of the wings, it's really thin. So if I had my one connection point right here, not only would that metal likely cool before it gets to this top area here and not fill out. But if I just put my sprue on the outside like we did with these, I would mess up all that texture that I spent all that time putting in there, and that would be sad. So we want to look at where the thickest part is, where we have texture on our pieces, and also think about something called, I believe it's called backflow. But the idea with metal when you're pouring into a casting is that metal does not want to make a U-turn. It doesn't want to go one direction and then come back the other way. So if I had my little dude and he was casted or sprued into the button, like this, just straight up and down. When the metal would flow into this part, it would have to go in and then try to travel backwards to fill up the ears. And it's not going to want to do that. It might do it, on an accidental thing, but it's not going to want to do that naturally. So whenever I place my models, thinking about where the screws are going to go, I want to think about what's the easiest direction for the metal to flow and make sure that it's not going to be making any U-turns in the pieces. I also had a ton of texture on the outside of these pieces. So I put all of my sprues on the inside of my bands where I knew I would have pretty easy access to them, and there was nothing that I was going to have to recreate or clean up afterwards. Um, so the most common kind of sprue shape that we'll see, I have it in the slides as well. Just the standard one solid little dude coming onto your object. Uh, Rachel, I believe, called it the lollipop, a lovely name for it. So with this piece, I could pretty easily have the sprue going straight into the middle of the heart, and it would be to the chunkiest object, and nothing would be kind of filling backwards. The Y shape is a really nice option for a lot of pieces, and this is usually with a slightly thinner piece of wire going to connect the two pieces. And with this band, I knew it was nice and thick enough that I didn't have to worry about the metal cooling down before it got to this piece up here. Otherwise, I might have switched where this was sprued onto the location. Um, and a lot of my pieces have this little ball right here. This piece probably did not need it, but this little ball was something that was taught to me by my graduate professor as especially a way to help out really, really delicate carvings. Adding a little ball before the bottom of the button or right before the object um, acts as kind of like a hot reservoir for a thicker chunk of metal to spin and push the metal down behind it. Um, so it will keep sitting there, keep the metal hotter faster for a longer period of time and let delicate parts of a casting fill out. Um, I don't like to put the balls directly next to the pieces that I cast because I really like having an easier time cutting off my sprues. And if I don't have to come in with a saw blade and do it very slowly by hand, then I will try to avoid doing that if I have to. But the little balls, adding these guys to my sprues, you do end up using more metal, but that metal is then coming back, getting cut off. And every time you cast, you can have 50% old material, 50% new material. And I just slowly recycle these back into the metal that I'm using for my pieces. So when I go to attach my sprues, I do want to think about that. Where is the chunkiest material? And where do I have texture that I don't want to lose out on? So for this piece, the sprues, we're doing the Y lollipop shape with one coming in from behind the piece here, and another one coming in behind the wings, just because I had carved it down so delicate there that I wanted to assure that enough metal and enough heat was going to pass into this area that I wouldn't end up with a gap or a hole. Um, the having that second sprue there, also, I feel like gives a chance for the gases and all the things that are going to possibly create a hole or an inclusion in your piece. Another spot to kind of full circle cycle through and hopefully end up in my button. I don't know if it's actually true, but so far has not backfired on me. So I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing because it's not broke. But the other type of sprue that we can add is what the lovely Rachel Shimpak calls a paranoia sprue. And this is especially good when you have little tiny dangly elements that you might want to make sure are going to fully fill. And a lot of times we'll do these with very, very tiny smaller pieces of screw wire, which these you can get from Rio and Auto Fry will have a collection of different sizes, as well as sometimes the shapes for making settings in wax, which I absolutely love messing with itty bitty little wire. But this is just a little 18 gauge or 16 gauge. Wait, no, what did I grab? I grabbed 14 gauge. I don't need that big. But these smaller wires, here's a little 18 gauge wire, can come in and connect pieces that you're worried about possibly not filling all the way to the end. His little ear is pretty chunky, so since I had screwed him in a way that I wasn't worried about backflow, I didn't do a little paranoia sprue to his ear. But if I only had one sprue down here and he had something maybe long and delicate coming off, adding another sprue to connect to that piece is going to make sure that you get a nice successful filling. So having actual sticky wax does help the process, but not having sticky wax, we can still make it work. But this purple wax, it really does become somewhat resistant once it has been really fully polished. Like the wax just kind of slips off of it. So that is sometimes why I will do this final Goo Gone shine after I've gotten my screws on, just to save myself from having a wax stick that just keeps sliding off of the piece. For the way I positioned this, I knew that I didn't want to backflow his little ears. So I had him upside down when I sprued him. So I put a sprue right behind his little head here. And I will know I want to come at this angle. So I want to pre-cut that end to be a nice little satisfying angled shape. A little bit of sticky wax to the tip here. Okay, so I need it to go on like that angle. Heat my little dude, add a little bit of sticky wax to the tip, and stick him on where I want him. And I a lot of times will come in and kind of, if I can, pinch it with my thumb like this so that I can kind of hold it there while I get the first wax welds in place. I do feel like I probably burn myself a good amount because I like doing it this way. But I've also gotten those asbestos fingers now of the metals field. So when I'm poking in, I like to feel the tip of the tool actually go into the purple wax. I like to feel that oh, I can't think of a better word than penetration, but I like to feel that tool sink into the wax itself. And if it just feels like I'm only encountering the pink, then I'll heat my tool up again and address that spot before I move on. And just like with the other pieces, we don't want to overheat the one. We don't want to go in a circle and possibly just melt that piece off. So I'm going to come opposite sign of the cross, come in there, and I can feel it going into the purple itself and melting. And I'll let that cool up there before I uh, go around the rest of the area and fill that in. Sometimes what happens with this part of the process is that your wax tool is kind of stealing wax away from that sprue as you are attaching it. So what you actually kind of end up with at the end is something that almost looks like that, and then your piece is there. And we want to avoid this as well as much as possible, because not only are we decreasing the amount of space that is allowing our metal to pass through, but having this kind of like funnel shape, it actually speeds up the metal. So it's going to speed up, hit that, and kind of spatter. So after I make sure that my material has a really nice, good connection, I want to go through and smooth out these connection points to make sure that my metal has essentially a slip and slide to get on its way to where it needs to go. We want that guy just flying. So once I come in and have this fully attached, let me actually just finish that up really quick. Mm-mm-mm. And I think I do like to do it in these two different steps where I'm welding first and then going through and adding material on to make sure that it's round enough. Because I feel like a lot of times when I try to make sure I have enough wax on my tool that it's going to curve as it's welding, it just splotches somewhere I don't want it. Doesn't actually go to where I need it to be. Fine, I'm across, getting it hot enough that I can feel the tool melting that harder purple wax. And yeah, now my sprue looks a little sad. So while I'm on the same area here, I'll load up my tool with a little bit of my wax. And I'm just gonna plop it down onto that seam and really let this area cool before I then go on to the next one. I don't want to overheat this and have the rest of the sprue just plop off. That would be terribly sad. But I also want to make sure that this piece is as nice and curvy as possible. And we want to try and avoid overhandling the sprue wax as well, because this is the volcano tube. This is the chute that is carrying that metal. So we want it to be nice and smooth. Having a lot of like jagged lines in the sprue wax as well is going to create kind of like a bumpy road situation for your metal as it's on its way into the piece. So if you do have a piece of sprue wax where you're like, oh, I don't know what happened, but that looks rough, just put it in your donor wax pile so that it can just, help you wax weld, but not necessarily carry your metal on the way to its piece. Somehow lost that little piece of, oh wait, there you are. Okay, so I've got this last little guy right here. I've got his other end is at a nice angle to that piece. And I want these also to be kind of like as short as they can be, so that the metal doesn't have a chance to cool as it's on its way to the piece. So sometimes I will kind of mess with this a little bit to see how short I can get this little X here. Once I have the pieces on, let's see. Boop. Hold it on to there. Okay, got my pinchy finger doing its work for me. The other place you can put them is on the edge of the piece itself to give really nice access. I don't know why I find it just somehow so much easier. I touched the tip of my finger with that tool and it took me like a good 10 seconds to realize I had. Oh, I do spend a lot of time gently blowing. Oh, I wax welded my finger to the piece. Gently blowing on the wax to kind of speed up this cooling process before I move to a new spot. Nice and connected. And we just want to make sure that that is as clean as possible. But I'm not going to probably sit here and uh, clean it up as much as I would on a piece that I was making for myself. So with these, I don't want to press super hard because I don't want to jiggle my waxwork that we just did. I want the tool to be kind of hot enough for it to just go through there. And then I want to join these little dudes, make their little Y. After I cut through one, I'll usually press it onto the stem of the other one and just kind of use the melted wax to help aid that process right there. And then I'm going to go in and weld that seam shut as well, really nice and smooth. Because this isn't the hard wax, I don't necessarily need to go through and seam it before adding additional wax because it's going to melt kind of very nice and satisfying all in one go. So let one side, let it cool, opposite seam. And then I want to make sure that this as well has a really nice, smooth little transition for my pieces. These are the ramp that are going to take them to victory at the bottom. So this little ditch right here, I want to make sure has a nice, gentle curve to it. Because all of these wax welds as well are another spot that the investment can come in, get its greedy little fingers into your pieces, and then end up somewhere you don't want it. So very, very soon. Okay, so once this is nice and together, can wax weld that end off. Again, I don't want to press too hard. I want the tool to be hot enough that it's just going to cut through it like butter. And this is where I will usually attach my little ball of wax. I'll usually use the really soft red wax just because I have an easier time getting it to round out really nicely. But you can use any wax that uh, strikes your fancy. But the red wax, and it's usually like the studios will have them as like the soft sprue wax as well for filling buttons. Works really nicely to just make a nice little smooth ball. But I do want to make sure, again, the reiteration over and over and over is that it doesn't have a spot where investment can go in and get into this little ball and create an issue uh, for my piece down the line. So I go through and I smooth out any little crack I see in the surface. And I'll put it in my hand like we used to when we were kids with Play-Doh or anything like that and get it to a nice round little ball. Because what I want this to essentially be is a spot for my metal as it's casting to spin and get really hot and just shoot into my piece to aid in that process. And I do the balls on centrifugal and vacuum. They're going to help with both just because you then have a reservoir like the button that's going to be helping the metal stay hotter longer. Get it nice and smooth. Okay. And this I put just right onto the base of that piece right there. So a lot of times when I need to attach something really big like that, I'll get my area that we're going to be connecting to, get that bottom flat and then also soft and just stick it on. And then go through just like with all the other steps and weld one side and then the other. And you do want to make sure these do connect into a new piece because when we get into the investment portion of it, the vibrations can break these pieces apart. And if that does ever happen, if you're investing and you see your waxes float to the top, You can stop at that point, rescue your waxes, rinse the investment off, and try again. But if you let it harden, it has been entombed at that point. There's no getting it back. I want to make sure, just like with all the other ones, that no one could come in and fault my weld spot.
Hosanna,
And
we
that there's
are at 1 o'clock, or I guess it's 4 o'clock Eastern time. So you're an hour in. Just wanted to let you know.
perfect. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And all of these spots are spots that I want to pay attention to and make sure that we don't have this pinching coming in, because all of them are then going to be potential points that that process can happen to the piece. So optivisors, reading glasses, anything that you can kind of come in and make sure that you've got really good connection on your pieces are going to help you in this process before we move on to investing. I especially inspect the ones that are inside of the band to make sure I didn't miss a spot there. Just because it's such a weirder angle, it's so much easier to miss the tiniest little crack, pinhole, something that's going to give you grief down the road. Um, so now the biggest thing that I see starting out uh, with my students is that they will forget to weigh this before they put it on a button. We have to know how much this little baby and its screws and its little base, how much this weighs. And so many times um, we put it on a button. I've done it myself and I go, oh, well, I can just find a button and I can weigh that button and then I can subtract that from my wax and that's fine. But I don't know why I've never found two perfectly identical buttons. They are all unique as we are. They all have their own kind of individual intricacies, and that little bit of difference in the weight of the wax is going to be really crucial. So if you do attach it to a button and you have not weighed it, just chop that bad boy off, behead him, weigh him, and move on to the next step from there, because it never ever actually comes out to a satisfying process. So when we're weighing our waxes, the little bad boy here, we want to make sure that we're always weighing in grams and that your scale is zeroed out when you start. Oh, that is a chunky boy. He has not been hollowed out or finished being refined. That is 7.8. That does not sound like a ton, but 7.8 is going to get multiplied by potentially two different other numbers. If you're working in uh, if you're working in brass, that number is going to be, I feel like everyone has slightly different like tiny variations on what that number is multiplied by, like 8 point something, rounding up to 9. We did for Now I'm double questioning everything. For bronze, you're going to multiply that number by 9. For silver, they had us multiply that number by 11. So for this bad boy, without it being refined down at this time, right now, would be 7.8 if it's silver times 11. Oh no, I'm not actually good at math. That should be an easy calculation. That's not for me. That's 85.8 grams before the button. That's a lot of silver. These guys do way less when I take time to fully refine them down instead of just spruing and weighing a little bit of a uh, chunky boy on its own. But that's a lot of metal. Oh, and now it's changed, 7.9. For the button, we typically add 10 to 15 grams. for this material here that's going to sit behind the piece and fill up the funnel. This shape is going to be determined by whatever shape your button has. And this is what's going to basically be the target that we're pouring for. So something like this is almost more than two. That's like 2.5 troy ounces of silver. That is an expensive boy. I could go back in behind the head and hollow out his face. There wasn't actually any need for it to be as solid as it needed to be. But if you're at a point where silver is really not expensive, I don't know, maybe go for it. Let's see how much his relative weighs. Yeah, 37.2. So just a little over a troy ounce. So definitely, he's a chunky boy. He'll rearrange your nose, but not as bad as what this boy is at right now. And this is really, really, really important to keep track of. In our studio at school, we have casting handouts so that they can fill out what their wax is, what it looks like, and write down all these measurements. So if there is some sort of math issue that has gone wrong, we can catch it before it goes too far down the road. And once your pieces are inside their flask, it's really, really hard to actually remember what they were. When I go into my investing process, am always usually working on at least 3 or 4 pieces at the same time because I feel like going through all of that, the measuring of the powder, the pouring into the piece, the actual casting, I like to make essentially it worth my time. So I'm usually setting up to do the investment process for multiple pieces at the same time. And when they're inside the containers before the investment actually fills in the piece, you can still see what they are. You'll see them inside like that or the other way. But once the investment has filled this piece, all we have are essentially steel tubes with white plaster on the top. So knowing what is inside that investment flask, so you know how much metal it is incredibly important. Um, when I go to do my pieces, and we invest our piece, I'll show you in the video, but we will usually add a strip of tape, some sort of duct tape, waterproof resistant tape along the top. And I write onto the tape on the pieces what the item is and what its weight is. So that once the investment is in there and I'm looking at maybe 3 or 4 identical flasks all filled to the top with plaster, I don't have to wonder about what that piece is. So for the fitting, let me back this up here. Okay, so for fitting our piece into a flask, how we choose a flask, you want to be able to have a good amount of space in between the walls of your object and also the top of your object. You want to have a little bit of space for the investment to fill the piece. For going in, to know if you have enough space to clear the top, just doing this at first is going to help you choose a flask. Having your fingers in there to simulate that end of the button and holding it in there and looking to the sides and making sure that you have enough space. This piece could go in a much smaller flask. This was the size flask I brought home with me from the studio that we teach at. So if it had, let's see, what's the angle? There we go. If it had at least, I like to give at least a 1/2 inch. They say you need at least 1/4 of an inch space between the item and the flask wall, then you're golden. So this could fit in probably a 2-inch flask, and this is a 3-inch flask. Why you need that space, why your piece can't be touching the side, is that that will create a spot where the metal will then blow out. And what it's going to do is it's going to travel down the side of the flask and it's going to explode out the side of the piece. It can also happen if you don't have enough material covering your actual top piece. You can blow out the back as well. And it's really unfortunate if that happens because the liquid metal mixes with the investment and it does become really hard to kind of cleanly bring that metal back to yourself. All right, so I have my little button here. I like to try to be really conscientious about cleaning up any little traces of plaster because I do get paranoid that this old plaster is going to essentially quicken up the time of my new plaster when I put it in there. This isn't so horrible that I think it would ruin anything, but probably something like this, I would give a nice little rinse and a scrub over just to make sure I'm not contaminating my piece. And this will usually have a hole down in there that sometimes the wax is coming straight out of. So you want to make sure that that has a good amount of wax in the piece. Just like with any of the other connection points, this connection point to your piece has to be wax welded really nice and thoroughly. Sometimes when I start out, I'll do just a quick kind of like, ooh, I'm melting the whole thing, and then chunk and hold it there for a second. If you need to angle the piece as well, this is now a good time to do it. So if I have a wax that's been hollowed out on the back, like with this object here, I started hollowing it out and didn't get very far. So it's not actually all that terribly hollow in there. But in the final metal, it's pretty hollow. This is a crazy place for bubbles to get trapped. It loves to get trapped there. So if we can slightly tilt it instead of having it just straight up and down, that's going to help those bubbles have a chance to escape when we get into the investment process. You can also do multiple waxes in one container. I get really paranoid when I've spent a lot of time on one wax where I go, if something about this flask or this investment is cursed, I only want it to kill one of you. Um, it, it, I just have OCD. You can absolutely put more than one piece into the flask at the same time. So I like to support my finger behind the piece so that if my wax for some reason tumbles, I might have a chance to catch it before it hits the table and it might not, mess up all my sprues or any damage to the piece itself. So I want to cool that wax and let it have a chance to set up and firm up before I come to a new area. I don't know if the Zoom can pick up on me creepy blowing on my. I apologize if it's a bad ASMR right now. All right.
We didn't hear any blowing, but I think
Okay.
it's a great idea to mention that you are doing so because those kind of little tips and tricks help along with the process.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so yes, I am gently blowing on my waxes to help speed up that drying time, but I don't want to rely on that too heavy and just be like da 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 and keep going because it will be more liquidy inside than just on that surface. And I'm essentially just seeing the surface change happen. But I have a nice smooth connection, a nice little smooth ramp for my boy, for the metal to make its way in on there. And now I have to connect the flask head. I don't know how many times I've accidentally, oh, I was actually about to make one of my classic mistakes. So debubbling. There are multiple ways to help discourage bubbles from forming. There's a material that Rio sells called vacuum film. And it's some type of denatured alcohol and some other types of chemical that you can put in a little squirt bottle and squirt onto the piece. And ideally, you want to squirt on a coat, let it dry, and then squirt on a second coat and let it dry before you put your investment in there. We didn't have that when I was taught how to cast. So what we used was the denatured alcohol inside our alcohol lamp. And so what we would do is after we had finished wax welding all of our buttons on, we'd blow our wax or our candle out, take the lid off so that we could access the alcohol inside and use a paintbrush to paint the surface before we would put our flask on and then invest. And this does help just give the wax a final coating so that bubbles have a less easy time sticking to it. And I'll do this to my sprues as well inside of my piece and just make sure I've got a nice coating on all those surfaces. You do not want to do these to do this to organics that you've dipped in some sort of resin or lacquer. Because what it's going to do is actually melt the lacquer and make it sticky again. So it ruins all your kind of hard work that you've done making something glossy. So you only want to use this if you're dealing with waxes. But if I forget to do this before I put my flask on, I can go down in afterwards, but it's just a little bit easier to make sure I have a nice clear coverage if I do it before I put that lid on. Okay, so now I have to get the flask onto the base. And for some reason, some of them are real loosey-goosey and some of them are tight. This one is a tight one. And I have multiple times beheaded a wax right off the button, attempting to get the flask head on. So I have a little trick for that I use for my pieces. I want to double check and make sure that I have nice, good, uh, good space in between my material, that my wax is not at kind of like an angle where, oh my God, maybe it's touching the side now, and double check that before I go in. And then I'm going to put the flask, oh, I almost decapitated just looking at it. I'm going to try and get it into one side a little bit. And then I'm going to go over to the edge of a table. And what I'm doing is I'm just overhanging the base using that gap from the table to allow me to leverage that button back. And then push that flask down in there without beheading my little wax piece. And I want to make sure it's down nice and even. And that I still have enough of a gap in between the top of my flask and where my wax starts. At our studio, we use a vacuum investment table that does not have, or it does have, but maybe it doesn't have it. We're primarily sticking the flasks on top. We're not using the recess that allows you to suspend the perforated flasks. Perforated flasks are fantastic for if you're especially doing very delicate organics, because it allows all that air to kind of impregnate the plaster and pool from all these different areas. But for a chunky wax, a traditional flask is going to be just fine. But I do want to make sure that I leave just a little bit of a gap when we're doing it that way. I don't want to fill it all the way to the top, because we want to be able to have that ability to create a vacuum between the table and the investment itself to start pulling the metal when we go to cast from the other direction. If you do fill it all the way to the top, what you can do is after it hardens, come in with a spoon and kind of very gently scrape it away and create a little bit of a dome so that you create this vacuum for yourself. But it's just easier to have a flask where if I stop a quarter of an inch from the top, I'm going to be fine. When we put I'll show you in the video, when we put our flasks into the when we put our investment into the vacuum caster machine, we bubble our investment twice. First, after we mix it, and then bubble the flask once the investment has been poured in so that we can pull out any air bubbles, gaps, things like that within the investment. And this causes it to rise kind of like an active yeast agent really quickly. So we want to have something that's going to keep this investment from bubbling up and over when we put it in that chamber. So they sell these like fancy like flask sleeves, just like a little tube that you put on top and you can take on and off. Those are lovely. Um, what I have always just used is some type of water resistant tape, like packing tape, duct tape, things like that. The duct tape has been hard to get off the flask sometimes, and it will sometimes leave a residue that doesn't want to come off and will get caught up on the outside of the what's it called? The recessed sides. So we want to make sure that this material is going to, I probably did this a little higher up than I needed to, um, because we want to make sure it's not going to break down here and just slough down. And we want to make sure it can't go up and over this part. So at this point, I'll write usually in Sharpie, I'll write pig and then the weight of the metal so that when this is just a little nondescript tube, I know what this guy is. Because when you're working in multiple uh, students casting all at the same time, you do kind of have to know what the metal is, what weight it is, and who is going to be going when. So we keep track of all of this material as well. Um, when we go to finally have the investment in there and it's hardened, which I'm about to switch to the videos that we have to show that process. Um, uh, this weight, which this should have plus 10 for the button, 95.8 grams, SS for silver, and then initials so that you know what is in that flask. That's kind of been our standard at every studio that has ever taught me casting for identifying what is in that flask. SS for sterling silver, B for bronze. If you have something like AS for Argentium silver, some type of distinguishing code that your system used for knowing what is in there. And then we'll primarily arrange the casting cabinets so that we can move through the different metals and weights in kind of a reasonable way. Okay, so I'm going to switch back on over to the videos I have of the investment process. I guess let's put it on me and then let's see. I think I have to share my screen is what I have to do. Do.
Yes, we see the share screen and we see your video. So
Okay.
that's where we should be.
Ooh.
And we're almost at a half hour till, just FYI.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so there's that. The Google. Mute. Every time I unmute myself, it mutes me again.
There we go. Sorry about that. When you got muted, I was trying to unmute, and I think we were trying
No,
to. I think we
just
were
going
working,
back and forth arguing
hitting the
over.
button in tandem. Yes, we hear you now. Thank you.
Oh, I thought it was just me fighting with the thing. Okay. Oh. Okay, so there we have the basic lollipop, the Y seam, the softening of that angle. These are by the lovely Rachel Shimpak. The textured brand, which she called a crown, is a lovely way to connect things that you don't want to do it on the inside or the outside, but you just approach that little seam and get three little guys on the outside there. And then the paranoia sprue going to those long areas of the piece. So here were my waxes when I first invested them, and we don't have any of the issue with that. Then backflow with the ears, the direction of the piece is going to go the direction that it needs. And like Rachel had said, the ball of wax really helps too, especially for something chunky as well, so that that wax is going into the piece. There's the little skull guys. I wanted to make sure, same thinking about tipping the button upside down, looking at how the metal was going to flow when it was actually casting and thinking about the direction of my waxes and how I was putting the sprues into the piece. So there's that little guy there. I just stuck it right to the outside of his head and then added a second sprue going to the back of that thin band to make sure that it would not have a problem. This is the vacuum film concentrate. So you do mix it down with, I think it has to be either I think you're adding the alcohol to it probably. It does contain acetone though on itself. And you can spray into the flask to add this to it if you've already put your flask on the outside as it is. And you don't necessarily have to wait until you add the investment, but it floats to the top of your investment as a pink film, and it's kind of alarming. This is the chart that's in our casting studio. This upper left chart is looking at figuring out how much investment and how much water you need, depending on the flask. If I have multiple little small ones, just picked a big flask size, mixed a big old bucket of investment and done multiple at the same time. But I don't teach my students to do it that way because it's a lot of just kind of intuitive guessing. And chances are they'll end up with not enough, which at that point, if you then need to mix more investment, it's going to be in two pieces and it's not going to bond properly. So I don't like to tell my students to do it that way because chances are they might do something where it's not going to end up well. Investment should never go down the sink. It's essentially just becoming plaster of Paris, a cement. So we always have rinse buckets for dealing with anything that has to be rinsed that's touched the uncured investment and the cured investment. So this is our steps that we give are on the cabinets in our studio so that they can remember the steps and refer to it. On here, I think it says that you have 7 minutes at the top. You technically have 9 minutes, but we like to kind of undershoot that so they speed themselves up a little bit. And then this is our casting order with the 3-digit initial code, the weight, and then the type of metal it is. A lot of times, if you're doing like a centrifugal casting, you'll work from one metal to another so that you don't have to switch the crucible back and forth. We're working with vacuum pouring little crucible ladles, so it is a little bit easier to alternate between what metal you're pouring. All right, so this is the first video. One of my students helped me put this together. She was recording individual things and then put it together. So the one thing that she did switch is that she measured her water and then her investment. And investment powder is incredibly sensitive to moisture. So usually we always recommend that you measure your investment out and put all that away before you start interacting with water to avoid contaminating the multiple box of the big thing. Um, what I, okay, how do I, is there a way to full screen it?
Can you pull at either, can you pull the screen? I guess you're on a device. Of course you can't pull it out. Um,
Yeah, I think because I embedded it, I could
uh-huh.
always,
This
hmm,
I'm seeing it pretty
you're
large.
seeing it big enough? Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
As long as it's not just a little tiny box. Um, that was her spraying her vacuum film in there just as an added protection for uh, uh, just making sure. So she measured her water there and now she's measuring her investment. Do not do that. The little bit of moisture might get into the bucket from having a little bit of leftover water on your hands, stuff like that from using the scoop. And we just want to make sure that doesn't happen. So ideally, after measuring your investment, you're going to then measure your water, put your water in your bowl first. And then we're going to bring that container of investment and start slowly incorporating it into the water. And you do want to always make sure that you're wearing a face mask when you do this because it's very, very, very fine particulate that's coming up into the air. And she set a timer for herself so she knows when she started the mixing incorporation process, she has 7 to 9 minutes to get it at that point. Um, Usually what I like to do is have my whole hand under the mixture and start smushing because then I'm incorporating less air into the process as well. So the more air that you're kind of squishing into the investment, the more chances that you have kind of air bubbles down the road. But what we're looking for is for any little crumbly bits of investment clogged in there. So I'm scraping my hand along the side and feeling what that stuff feels like until I have it strained down to a really nice, runny kind of pancake batter is the consistency that we're looking for. And then we put the investment into bubble the first stage by just itself. So for this, we're making sure it's set to investment and then it's turning on and we're watching that pressure rise. Sometimes if the pressure doesn't rise, either the bell jar does not have a good connection underneath, or with these guys, sometimes it's slightly set to casting instead of investment and it's not pulling from the right side of the table. So those are the two different things to check. With my investment on this first level, I like to let it bubble for about 30 seconds. And if it's really close to the top, what I will do is I'll tap on the table like that to help break the bubbles up and keep it from overflowing. If it's a ton of investment, I can release the pressure a little bit to kind of stop and bring the bubbles down and keep it from going down into the machine if it looks like it's going to about to be a horrible, horrible process. So then with these tables, we want to release the pressure before we turn them off. If you turn them off while it's still under pressure, it can suck oil down into the engine. Ours, for some reason, does not go lower than 5 when you turn it off. It just refuses to. It's a little kind of old guy. And then we want to take that investment and pour it into our piece, aiming down the side so that it's sliding down the side of the flask and coming up underneath your waxes to kind of gently um, swallow them. And then we can tilt it upright and finish so that we have a good amount of material on top of our piece, but still leaving that gap for the vacuum part. And you can see the vacuum film has kind of now come back out. At this point, I like to bubble it for usually 45 seconds to a minute and a half. And I'll sit there and I tap the edge just a little bit so that any possible bubbles that are around or trapped near my piece are gone. And that tape, you can see the investment bubbling up up the side is going to stop that investment from going down into the machine. So it's very, very important to have some sort of collar gap because it's going to rise about 2 or 3 inches. So she's just tapping to get all the bubbles out that she possibly can for that piece. And then again, you want to release the pressure before you turn it off. I think she almost went for the power button there for a second. And let that pressure drop. I don't know if she has a band here. So one thing as well, when you are transporting your your flask back and forth between, always, always, always pick a hand up, put it under the button. This button is on there snug as a bug in a rug, but there are some floppy loose buttons. And I have watched a student bubble their flask, pick it up by the sides like this, lift it, and it just came out the bottom into the machine like the most horrible trifle disaster. So always make sure that you have a hand underneath your button when you're transporting your investment, your flask filled with investment back and forth between the machine. And that investment will take about 10 minutes to firm up. Um, this was just the angle she had had. Oh, it's so loud. Let's turn that off. The angle she had had with the first one, you couldn't quite see the roiling boil, and you can see her bowl overflowed the first time. That's what that big stripe on the inside of the bell jar is. Walking in, it was overflowing, and we dropped it off. But you'll see the material start to rise, and then you'll see all the air bubbles coming out of the piece itself. And if your wax welds are not good, at this point, you'll start seeing little materials float to the top and breach. If you see your wax float to the top, just stop the process, put the thing in a quench bucket and rinse that investment out because you can still save your waxes. Your waxes are going to be fine. You can reattach it to a new button. But if it hardens at this point, then it's just in there. It's done. And I leave that, oh, it's just playing it again. I leave that paper on there until my plaster has hardened up. And then I remove it, scrape any remnants across the top, and scratch those details into the surface. I don't just draw it with a pencil because the graphite might disappear. I want it carved into the surface so that the people who are putting the flasks in know what that material is. And you always want to remember to pop your button off as well. It's probably one of the most satisfying parts is yoinking that off of there and seeing the little empty guy left behind. And if you have multiple students in a studio like we do, you can multi-tier your waxes or your flasks. You just want to make sure that you have a spot in between where the wax can drain out during the burnout process. And we like to keep our flasks at about 1,000 degrees is the holding temperature that we like for our pieces. Ideally, you want your investment to be between 800 and 1,000. Usually the hotter it is going to work better for the delicate pieces, keeping that metal hot as it flows into the smaller areas. It can be a little cooler if it's a chunkier piece and you know you have that metal going behind the piece. But 1,000 degrees is a nice holding spot for going just straight from the kiln to our pour area. This is if Rachel, if you're in here, I caught your face for half a second. I'm so sorry. So this is our oxyacetylene torch. This is just a ceramic crucible that we're preheating with a little bit of the Magic Pixie borax powder in there for our metal. And we have our kiln off to the left-hand side and our vacuum caster investment machine right there. And that is a bundle of wet paper towels folded on top of each other with a little hole pulled out the middle for where that piece. So she's got the flask put it on the wet paper towels with the button side up so that funnel is there. And we want to see that metal really nice and liquidy and moving. You want to see that kind of jiggly movement in the piece. So we'll often do a little jiggle and check. And you want to keep this torch on the metal and the funnel as it pours into the piece, into that button. And this machine is under vacuum. So it is sucking from the bottom and kind of pulling that metal down towards it. And Rachel just took a little bundle of borax and floofed it onto the button there, which I see a lot of metalsmiths do like to do that, where it's kind of almost like it's controlling the oxygenated environment that the metal is. I don't know if that's actually the truth behind it, but there is this kind of I've seen a lot of people who fully like will mountain borax to create a no oxygen environment for their metal. Oh, no, I forget that anytime I do the next, it just plays the video again. So once it has had that metal pour in there, we usually want to let it cool for about 5 to 10 minutes. Usually the timing works really, really well when one student comes in, casts, whoever has gone previously before them. Once that next person is done, usually the flask before them is ready to quench. So quenching, you do not want to do if you have any stones casted in place. So if you have stones casted in place, you just have to let that investment cool at room temperature. But for the most part, we put our flasks into a quench bucket because we don't want any of this material going down. Now that I've learned that I can, oh wait, no, we didn't hear the sizzle. Lovely sizzle. And I'll usually hold it under the water until you can no longer feel the vibration of the bubbles anymore coming from the flask itself. And usually that will tell you it's at a temperature that you can now encounter the metal and get in there without burning your hands. So the first thing almost everyone does is grab their metal and see how they're wax casted. But then we also have to clean up this investment while it's still soft enough, getting it off as much off of the model and off of the steel flask is so much easier while it's at this point before it dries out than if you set it to the side and leave it. You also want to remember to do this with your investment mixing buckets. Getting in there and rinsing it out while it's still super pancakey is easier. If you forget it, sometimes it's better just to let it fully dry and crack it like a sunburn, or not like a sunburn. I don't crack my loved ones when they're sunburning. But we'll always have little tiny tools, little tiny knives, little soldering picks that have passed their prime, and little toothbrushes that we can go in and get that investment out of, get the investment out of there. So once the piece dries, these little tiny areas of investment that are down into there usually will be a lot harder to get out than if you took it, put it from the quench bucket into an ultrasonic so that it can vibrate the last of that investment out there, and then into pickle to get that piece cleaned up. With these parts, I think maybe I took them out. I think I just took this picture and then I put them right back in. So I think you can see there's like bubbles in the eyes. So I didn't let these dry out before I finished cleaning them up. I just took a picture and threw them right back into the piece. So when I go to clean these up, essentially all I'm using is a sprue cutter, and then usually a little bit of a cutoff disc to grind down where that last little connection point was. But if you go in with a saw blade to cut it off, it is so much cleaner. But the sprue cutter and the cutoff disc are very quick for me. So for these pieces, the surface finish was how my wax started. So once I got my sprue off of there and it out of the pickle, I took it straight to a buffing wheel with, I think, some red rouge. and polished that surface up. And there wasn't really any sort of other intervention I had to do. How my waxes looked were how my metal came out, which was really, really lovely that that worked out that way. And that's kittens. Um, so that was what I had for the presentation for the casting for this time period of it. Um, were there any questions about the PowerPoint before I exit out of that? If anyone wanted me to go back to any slides, or is it okay to stop sharing that screen?
Hosanna, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
So regarding your the vacuum casting part, when you transported your flask over to the vacuum area, do you have the vacuum on when you set it down on the table, or do you set it down on the table, turn on the vacuum, and then pour?
Set it on the table, turn on the vacuum, and then pour. Um, I don't
Turn it off
actually,
to release the vacuum and then take it off the table?
yes. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. I definitely did not say that in the part of it, but yes, the when you're bringing it over, um, our studio is laid out very nicely where it's kiln, vacuum table, fire brick area for pouring. So it all feels very close and easy to move around. I have definitely been in studios where the amount of space that you need to walk to get to the kiln back to the pour area feels very awkward. So I do always like to make sure there is a second person there with me so that someone can be handling the torch while someone is handling the flask and you're not relying on yourself for both when you are working on those larger areas. But I know there are plenty of people who do it on their own. But just for me, I always like to know that if I'm gonna maybe tip over and have a torch accident, someone else is there who can help me get help. But yes, we once the metal is at that nice liquidy stage, it's usually our sign to go very quickly, grab the flask out of the kiln, flip it over, and then take over control of the torch and make sure that we're pointing that torch on the funnel and the metal so that the metal itself is being hot. The flask is taking some of that heat of the torch and prepping the way.
And do you primarily vacuum cast versus centrifugal? And what do you find the pros and cons between both if you have practiced both in your journeys in casting?
I do both probably about equally. Our the studio that I ran casting in North Carolina had a centrifugal and they had a vacuum table. And so we would do a lot of centrifugal if we knew that our metals were really chunky, and we weren't terribly worried about things, but we did have a period where we go through organic casting. And when you're dealing with a lot of very like long, spindly items, if you have the opportunity to do the inset vacuum casting where it is going down into the chamber, is the best possible for very, very, very thin organics. If you don't have the perforated flasks, I know that some people will create an there are a few things you can buy. You can either wax weld little wires down the side of the flask. And what that does is create little channels all across the outside of the investment to increase that airflow on a regular flask. And they now also sell, it's essentially like perforated wax sheets that you can put along the inside of your flask to create a perforated like effect to the steel flask to increase that airflow on standard flasks. So if you do have something that's very, very, very thin and very spindly, I do recommend increasing the amount of airflow that that plaster can encounter. I love centrifugal casting for just it makes me feel like some sort of person from another time and place and world when you just let that thing fly and it starts spinning. It is far more terrifying than the vacuum casting just because there is a little bit of an element of more things to go wrong. We had our centrifugal caster had got its spring got off kilter, and so it would rock as it casted. And
Mhm.
so if we slightly added too much metal, if someone did something wrong, it would rock up and spray in an arc liquid metal all over the container, which luckily we had the kind with the lid where you slam it down as you let it go. But I feel like centrifugal casting, when you have an older machine, is very much more kind of like, all right, we're about to maybe maim ourselves badly. But I know that there are people who also still do, the swing casting where
Oh
you
gosh,
use your own centrifugal casting, and that's, involving metal going straight above your head. So that seems like there's still people out there taking more risks.
definitely. And as we're rolling through to the end of the video presentation and to the end of the class, do any of the rest of you have any questions for Hosanna?
And I do have the Facebook group that I sent the link to the first week that I will be there on the Facebook group, or you can reach me through my email as well. Always happy if you have questions down the road as you pick this up, or if you pick up a tool, feel free to reach out to me, and I would be so happy to talk to you about it. So you don't have to come up with the question just today. If you think of something from a month from now, feel free to reach out to me, and I'd love to talk to you about it. Oh, there is one last thing that I forgot to mention. I just looked down and saw them. Um, Incorporating findings in your casting. I always like to, if you do it in the wax, why not? Rio sells these lovely little wax tubes. So on pendant items and other things like that, I like to cut little pieces of these and incorporate my findings cast into the piece already so that I don't have to go and solder onto heavy pieces afterwards. So I don't think I added a link to this to the supply list, so I will send the link for this part number. Apparently, it's patent pending by Gary Cowdery Profiles by Ferris, but I love these guys. These are fantastic for incorporating like a bail onto a back of a piece without having to then solder it on afterwards. That was the one thing I forgot to say when we were going through the main part.
And then could you also mention I believe you have another upcoming class with Pocosin?
It's not until next summer. So it's
Okay.
the June of 2026. I'm going to be on campus with Pocosin, teaching casting in their workshop, which I went to grad school in North Carolina. So I'm so excited to be out there again in that studio. It's going to feel like coming home.
Very fun. Good. That will be fun for you to be able to get out there and get in the studio on site.
Definitely. It's going to be lovely, lovely, lovely. And I emailed around. If people did not see it, let me know. But I emailed around specifically what the number is for and the title of the shape for the ones of the wax carvers that I am using most often. If you do decide that you want to purchase some of these individually. These on certain sites you can buy either in little groups of six or one at a time. And there are about six that are the ones that I use the most commonly. And I emailed those numbers and names over. So if you didn't get that, let me know and I can send it again or uh, find some other way to make sure it gets to you.
Yeah, we can take a peek and see if that all got emailed out, and if not, certainly send a group text or a group email out and make sure everybody
Yeah.
gets those emails. So thank you for that.
I think sometimes people's also, if sometimes email inboxes will see that it's multiple people being BCC'd and they assume it's some sort of spam, and your email will try and save you from yourself. So hopefully that didn't happen.
Good.
Yes.
All right. Well, any other final questions for Hosanna? Thank you so very much for that workshop. We all had a great time and really enjoyed learning from you and being in your studio space and in your school space and
My kitchen.
seeing the different locations from where you work. So thank you for sharing all of that with us. And everybody, for those of you who are joining us on the recorded version, welcome. We hope you guys enjoy the time with Hosanna as we all did live. And we look forward to seeing you in further Pocosin online classes. There have been new classes that have been scheduled for through midsummer, I believe, at least through June. So be sure to check those out. And we will be seeing you guys at another class online soon, we hope. And thank you all for joining us. The recording should be out. I believe that comes out within the same day, if not by tomorrow. So you can always go back on your notes. And if you need a refresher, you'll have quite a bit of time to be able to watch the video again and add to those mental notes or those physical notes. So without further ado, if there aren't any further questions, we will let everyone out of class to enjoy the rest of their beautiful weekends.
Thank
Thank you all
you.
so much for
Thanks,
joining me.
everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Susanna.
Bye,
Bye,
Valerie. Bye, Becky. Bye,
Becky.
Gail.
Bye.
All right, let's
All right, let's.
Take care, Valerie.
get there.
Okay.